Okay. Well, this is a busy slide that I'm going to show you next, but it's my attempt to kind of wrap this bookend idea around with regards to where all of the books of the Old Testament can be placed and dropped in. So basically, I start with the timeline going back to the time of Abraham. Then we've got the conquest, the out of Egypt into the book, the period of the conquest and the time of that 400 period that we looked at, Judges and Ruth. 1,000 years around time of David. So you see up here on top the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel that get us through the United Kingdom. And then the divided kingdom, 931. So we've got the division of the kingdoms. That historical period is recorded in the books of Kings. And then we have our first exile in 722. So the northern nation of Israel falls, Samaria falls, the capital city of Israel in the north, and then Judah in the south. 586, Jerusalem falls. So those are significant years that we see. There's a 70-year exile period, and then in 538, we read it here in Ezra, and at the end of Chronicles, the Cyrus decree, which is the decree that allows the faithful Jews, the faithful remnant that comes out of this exilic period, to come back to Jerusalem to rebuild the covenant community, the temple, and the walls around the city. That's the timeline. But why is this significant? God is king, the establishment of his name and the extension of life. Because this is the beginning and the end of all of this history that takes place. And it is anticipating out of this history, the anticipation is that there's more history yet to be accomplished by God. God has this future. This doesn't end, right? But you can see where, you've got the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, that are going to give us the patriarchal history up to the time of the coming up out of Egypt. Then we've got the wisdom books here as a kind of a collection that drops right in the middle, right on top of this time during the monarchy. So in this class, we'll cover the wisdom books, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Job. Yes, the book Song of Songs. Interestingly, down in Trinidad, I taught on the book of Song of Solomon. So I'm just going to give you a spoiler alert. I'm not going to treat it as an allegory. It's not God's love relationship with the church, but it's a practical book, Song of Solomon, written, I would say, by King Solomon near the end of his life, looking back on a life of mistakes. But it's a book that focuses in on the celebration of romance in the context of a marriage relationship and all of the stages leading up to and on the wedding day, wedding night, consummation of the marriage, and then beyond. So I introduced this idea to the pastors in Trinidad. And I was in a room, and some of the ladies were sitting in the back row. All the guys were forward. And some of the ladies were there. They started amening. Amen! Hallelujah! They were just getting so excited because here I was in a seminary class talking about the celebration of romance, and so the ladies were loving this, and we just got done talking about the Proverbs 31 woman at the end of the book of Proverbs, and then I jump into Song of Solomon, and one of the gals raised her hand and says, "We've talked about the Proverbs 31 woman, but I want to know, where can I find the Proverbs 31 man?" None of you get that? That was okay. That was her joke. I thought it was funny. But then at lunch, they came over and talked to me, and they said, "What you've said in class will revolutionize our churches. Nobody has ever shown us this before. We live in a culture where we don't even teach or preach from the book Song of Solomon. We've been taught that it was a book to stay away from, let alone use in our ministries." And they were all saying, "You've given us permission because it's in God's Word. We're going to take this back to our churches and help our young couples, or our married couples, young and old alike, is to be the one place, right, in the watching world to see what does it look like for a couple to be in love. Where should we be looking to see this, right?" So I had a totally different response from the pastors down there. They loved it. But although I will say, I don't know if this was on your watch, Austin, but I did have, when I was teaching the book Song of Solomon amongst undergraduate students, I did have one time a girl just stood up and said, I protest. We're not supposed to talk about this stuff in school. We're not supposed to talk. And she left. She walked out of my class and didn't come back. So it's a controversial book, right? Just get ready. So we'll talk about wisdom books. What we won't talk about in this class are all the prophet books. And here's how I organize the prophets. So if you take me for OT3, I don't follow the arrangement that's in our English canon. I follow the timeline of the prophets. So these are pre-exilic prophets, prophets that were active before the fall of Samaria, Amos, Hosea, Jonah, and Isaiah. And then we have a whole group of exilic prophets leading up to the fall of Jerusalem in 586. Jeremiah, for example, on the streets of Jerusalem as the city falls. He's active. Ezekiel, he's gone with the exiles to Babylon to be their pastor, and he's their prophet. So he'll be pastoral for the faithful remnant that have gone into exile. And then we have our post-exilic books, like we've been focusing on Zechariah. We mentioned Malachi and Haggai. I'll throw Joel in there as well. But then we will come back and talk about these history books, Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah, with regards to this post-exilic activity. And we'll talk about those later in this class as well. But this is going to be a major theme. God is king. If God's been dethroned, when will he be rethroned? That's the question that the prophets ask. And they look ahead to the day of the Lord that's coming as a means of encouraging the faithful remnant, wherever they are. So this is a big deal. Now, when we get to the history books, and we'll look at, especially when we get to Kings, that whole history, 400-year period of the kings during the divided kingdom, guess what we're going to find? The author there is giving us, almost like the book of Judges, another 400-year period of what it looks like to practice syncretistic religion and forgetting God. How many kings, we'll just give you a heads up, how many kings in Israel and the northern kingdom will receive a positive evaluation? You should remember this. Remember? Oh, come on. 0. 0 northern kings receive the closest one is Jehu. But he's the one that goes on that killing spree, taking revenge against the judgment against the house of Ahab, Jezebel, the whole thing. Yeah. 0. None of them. They all do bad. They do a poor job according to the sins of Jeroboam the first. How many kings in Judah in the southern kingdom? You remember? 8. See, Rebecca remembered. She had me. Did you have me as an undergraduate? Yeah, I see you remember. 8 kings in Judah receive kings like, Josiah, Hezekiah, and some of those reforming kings. Those are the kings we're talking about. So it's not a good time period in history during this time of chaos. Right here is what we're talking about, this 400-year period during the history of kings. And we'll see that when we get. So there's this, again, crisis over kingship. But you can see who starts turning up the volume knob of getting the attention of God's people. In other words, faithful remnant, wherever you are during this chaotic period, even into the exilic period, who's going to start speaking for God and reminding the faithful remnant, no, God's not given up on you. There's this day of the Lord. This is a day that's coming for you. This is the encouragement. So it comes from these prophets. They start speaking up, and we drop them into this. And that history there, the messages that are coming from these prophets is overlapping, obviously, that same history that we see up top. So that might be a helpful slide just to kind of help you see the big picture of why I think this theme of God on his throne, God is king, his name, his reputation is one, and the extension of life and blessing, I think helps us track through that entire history of 39 books of the Old Testament. So, all right. Let's move on to another topic that overlaps a little bit with some of what you'll read in your textbook on the chapter that's for this week. Before we talk about our first book, Samuel, one of the things that we want to kind of talk about is where the book of Samuel falls into the arrangement of what would be called the Tanakh. That's the Hebrew arrangement of the books, the Hebrew Bible or canon. So remember I said the Hebrew canon is arranged a little bit differently than our Reformation version of the canon, post-Reformation, Protestant Reformation. And the book of Samuel falls into what's called the former prophets. So this former prophets section here, and then we have the latter prophets. So prophets are the Nevi'im. This is the Torah, the first 5 books, Moses' books, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And then the section called writings, or the Ketuvim. Ketuvim. Should be a TH on there. So we have Joshua, Judges, and then we have Samuel, and then Kings. So those form the kernel called the former prophets. So the textbook will bring up this topic with regards to the scholarly conversation. Really the question is this, is just to focus on the book of Deuteronomy, which is kind of like the epilogue of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. So it's like the capstone book of the Torah, or the first 5 books, the Pentateuch. Then we've got Joshua, Judges, and then Samuel. So how, really the question is the relationship of the book Deuteronomy. What was that?
Just logged in or logged off.
Okay, some screaming kid in the background. Yes, that's a reminder to all of you, don't activate your camera, video feed, or your audio feed at home. Otherwise, we'll hear your screaming cat. Yeah, and hear it on the TV. We'll call on you if we ask you that you turn on your audio. That's the one downside of this new technology, is everybody at home can turn on, turn off, which is not a bad thing, but anyway. All right. Oh, I bet I knew who that was. I'm not going to mention the name. Okay. Now that totally distracted me. So the relationship of Deuteronomy, is it come as a capstone to the Pentateuch, or the scholarly conversation? We're going to get into this. Does Deuteronomy serve as the beginning book of the former prophets? What we're going to find is Deuteronomy is very influential with regards to, you might say, the theological evaluation of the kings, or the time of the monarchy, United Kingdom, and then the divided kingdom. So some scholars who like to be ornery will like to separate Deuteronomy from the Pentateuch, and they'll talk about a Tetrateuch, and then they'll add Deuteronomy to the former prophets book, and want to talk about this thing called Deuteronomistic history. Practice saying that word, Deuteronomistic history. Okay, so that's Deuteronomy plus the former prophets together. Some of this builds on the critical theory of what we talked about in OT1. We evaluated the documentary hypothesis, famously known as JEDP theory, right? So the documentary hypothesis is what we talked about and evaluated when we had OT1. So I'm not going to have time to give you the full-blown version now. Of course, I argue against the JEDP theory because I think what we see in the first 5 books of the Old Testament is a continuity of mind with regards to the human author as well as the divine author. We're not talking about 4 Moseses. We're talking about one Moses. But some of this discussion of authorship and where these books fall into history informs the scholarly conversation with regards to Deuteronomistic history. So here's a chart that kind of breaks it all down a little bit. So the documentary hypothesis is going to propose so-called sources, starting with the Yahwist source in the 10th century BC, and then we have another source called the Elohist source following in the 8th century BC. Then we have them combined at the end of the 8th century, and then we have a D source. This is the book, largely the book of Deuteronomy, in the 7th century BC. And then the last source to come along is the priestly source, and that's in the mid-6th century BC. Then all those were seamed together. You see JEP, according to this scholarly discussion, they'll talk about a Tetrateuch at that point. Only then, with the D source coming in, what would be called the term redacted in or edited in together into one unit. So there during the time of Ezra, the priestly ministry of Ezra, is about the time that they'd argue for the full Pentateuch to emerge as a single unit. So you can see what this does to anybody that wants to read the first 5 books of the Old Testament and talk about Moses, the author. All of this activity is happening after the time of David. And you see some of the historical events in and around the so-called sources of the Pentateuch. This gets into, a huge conversation. But what we have here as a result, and what the textbook will discuss, is with regards to if the argument, let's see, I'm looking ahead here, sorry. The book Deuteronomy, the critical scholarly position will suggest that the book Deuteronomy is a product of the 6th century BC, and then because of that serves as a prologue to the books Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Separating Deuteronomy from the Torah, thus, then leaves us with a Tetrarch, 4 books, Genesis through Numbers, and then the scholarly discussion would then focus on the Deuteronomistic history, starting with Deuteronomy, then Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. So that whole history. All right, minus the book of Ruth. Ruth is put in the other section of the Tanakh. So there we have our Hexateuch, Joshua, and our Tetrarch. So these 2 items here, back on that chart that we saw before, here's the book, the D source, and then eventually we've got our Deuteronomistic historian, the author here, seaming together Deuteronomy with Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings in and around 550 BC. And that becomes a source that eventually influences the Pentateuch. Here's our Tetrarch, and here's our Deuteronomistic history up here. So that's what we're talking about on this slide. So the textbook will talk about this. The scholar who came up with this Deuteronomistic history is Martin Noth. All of these guys, largely, most of them are Germans. He's the one that proposed this idea, building on a lot of the same kind of thinking that went into the whole formation of the Pentateuch, the documentary hypothesis. So this is what we're talking about here. Martin Noth will also try to identify the theological big idea of Deuteronomistic history as what's called retribution theology. So if you take parts of Deuteronomy, like the curses section in Deuteronomy 28, and then the blessing section that we find in Deuteronomy 30, the combination of those 2 chapters creates this retribution theology, which is going to be a big theological foundation for the evaluation of the history that happens from during that time period, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. So all of that is Martin Noth's observation. So in other words, this Deuteronomistic historian is writing in exile during the exilic period. We saw that back here. So during this exilic period, and then in anticipation of the return, he's writing this Deuteronomistic history. His audience are those who are in exile. So this retribution theory or theology is directed at those who are in exile. They're the ones that need to be told and reminded over and over and over again of why they're in exile, right? So goes the theory. So those who have gone to exile, hey, why are we here? Read my history. In other words, the Deuteronomistic historian has written this down, and he's given this evaluation of the failure of the king after king after king after king, and why we're in exile. So that's the idea. Now, I don't like it necessarily. This is what it looks like with regards to kind of like the first level subheads of the Deuteronomistic history, starting with Deuteronomy. You can see where Deuteronomy is dropped in. And then you get to the book of Joshua. Then you get to the origins of the monarchy, Judges, and then up to 1 Samuel 6. The golden age of the monarchy. You've got a good section of the history written there. 1 Samuel 7 through 1 Kings 8. That's David and Solomon. And then you've got the divided kingdom and the decline. as the rest of basically the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. And then the epilogue there at the end of Kings. Kings will end its historical coverage with the fall of Judah and the destruction of Jerusalem. So all of that is what we have in the so-called Deuteronomistic history. The problem I have just a broad... Are we okay, Patrick? Okay. So part of the problem that I have with this is the dislodging of the book Deuteronomy from the first 5 books of the Old Testament. I find it very difficult to dislodge Deuteronomy. If you take Moses' authorship seriously, you see the unity of the book, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. You recognize very, very quickly that what we have here is a collection of instruction. All of that we read in the first 5 books is intended for Israel in preparation for the Promised Land. So we have, those chapters in Deuteronomy, for example, that are anticipatory of what's coming. In other words, Moses has his prophet hat on, not unlike any other prophet, is hearing from the Lord with the anticipation of the fork in the road that's going to come. If you go this direction, there's going to be exile and the experience of exile, but if you repent, God will restore you and bring you back. So it's that retribution theology that I think Moses is responsible for, not some author writing in the midst of the exile. And I build my case also against this approach to understanding Israel's history from this slide. Another kind of a weakness that we see with the attempt to kind of structure the Pentateuch and the historical books after is basically the reality that there were prophets active right on top of this same history. So a prophet like Amos, for example, we see that he's active right in this period leading up to the fall of Samaria, right in 732 to 722 BC when Samaria finally falls. The prophet Amos is active as a prophet. So what does this do to our theory, especially with regards to the documentary hypothesis? Well, one of the things that the prophets were doing, especially the early prophets, the pre-exilic prophets, Amos, you see the same thing in Hosea, is that they're coming up with what's called a covenant lawsuit. A covenant lawsuit against Israel, against the northern nation. And where do they go to find their, in terms of a legal idea, think of a courtroom, you've got your prosecuting attorney. Where's he coming up with evidence for his case against the guilty party? The first 5 books of the Old Testament. He's drawing from Deuteronomy. He's pulling largely from a lot of these prophets, Amos, especially Hosea. They're very familiar with the book Deuteronomy. They're pulling from Deuteronomy. You see it all over the place. They build their covenant lawsuit against Israel and the syncretism and the idolatry that they're involved with, quoting and pulling from and alluding to the teachings and instructions of Moses. So here's, part of the case against this is that if Deuteronomy as a completed book is not even coming about until sometime just before the fall of Jerusalem, you've got a problem. And where's Amos getting his, source material? Even if the book, the e-source isn't even around until after Amos. The only possibility is you have maybe this Yahweh source. But he's pulling from Deuteronomy. According to the critical, theory, Deuteronomy is not coming around until sometime during the reform efforts of King Josiah. So you see a problem with that already. Deuteronomy is a book not coming around until the 7th century BC. So here's what it looks like with that same slide. You've got a prophet like Amos making his covenant lawsuit case against Israel. He's talking about Pentateuchal curses, judgment, and what will happen as a result, exile. That's his case and his warning that he's given to his audience. Everybody leading up to the fall of Samaria, he's saying, hey, this is the path you're going down. Or, if you repent, God is going to return and bring restoration. And these is part of the Pentateuchal blessings. All, again, coming from the book of Deuteronomy. So instead of the JEDP being way down here, in other words, the completed Pentateuch, it looks a little bit more like Amos is looking at, reading, and understanding a book that was already available and completed in such a way that the people that he's talking to and addressing should have known better. In other words, he's not making it up himself. He's not coming up with these laws, these charges, like he'd be Moses. No, he's got a source, not a completed source. This is I would argue, the Pentateuch, completed by Moses. It's a book that's available to the people, and this is why prophets like Amos and also Hosea are pulling from this as a source. So let's look at one example that comes out of this just to show you what it looks like in the text. I know this gets a little technical, but in other words, if you can think of a prophet like Amos or Hosea building their case against Israel, in other words, an audience that should have known better, let's look at the prophet Amos. Let's take a look at chapter 2. Amos chapter 2. This is just one of many examples that I could cite. Hosea, Amos. Joel, Amos. There we go. Amos chapter 2. And you start to see in the early chapters here the prophet Amos starting to rev up his covenant lawsuit case against Israel. He's writing to the wealthy elite. Israel's a well-to-do nation at the time. Jeroboam II is reigning as king. Disasters around the corner with regards to the Assyrians that are going to come down and eventually destroy the capital city of Samaria. But here we have Amos in chapter 2, beginning in verse 6. Thus says the Lord, and this is a section here, judgments against Judah and Israel. For 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4, I will not revoke its punishment. Because they sell the righteous for money and the needy for a pair of sandals. Now you can hear a covenant lawyer railing against the people. He's got them in a courtroom, and you can picture him as the prosecuting attorney building his case against the guilty party. These who pant after the very dust of the earth on the head of the helpless also turn aside the way of the humble. And a man and his father resort to the same girl in order to profane my holy name. And on garments taken as pledges, they stretch out beside every altar. And in the house of their God, they drink the wine of those who have been fined. You're a courtroom lawyer there a little bit. Kind of hear it in the message. Yeah, that's the right way to read Amos. There's a lot going on here in this little section, but you can see one of the big theological themes that comes out in the prophet Amos is Israel's mistreatment of the poor and the needy and the outcast in their communities. The wealthy elite class, and they're outright taking advantage of the orphans, the widows, the young, the poor, the defenseless. And right here you see this graphic picture and this reference to garments taken as pledges. Might read over that kind of quickly if you don't know what's kind of going on there. Let me show you where that comes from. The teaching of Moses, mind you, it comes from 2 places. Let's look at Exodus chapter 22, starting in verse 25. Exodus 22, in a section that Moses is instructing on how to, treat people fairly with regards to property rights. Right? He's giving instruction in all nooks and crannies of what a covenant community should look like. He's defining this for Israel before they get to the promised land. And here in Exodus 22, verse 25, if you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you are not to act as a creditor to him. You shall not charge him interest. Israel isn't supposed to build their economy on interest and a bunch of people owing money to each other, right? It was not supposed to be that way. And if you see here, if you ever take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, you are to return it to him before the sun sets. For that is his only covering. It is his cloak or her cloak for his body. What else shall he sleep in? And it shall come about that when he cries out to me, I will hear him, for I am gracious. Now, it's interesting. This cloak is this most expensive article of clothing that would have been owned by a common person. It served as the sleeping bag at night. If they're traveling from city to city, they've got a cloak. It serves as their warmest outer garment that they wear to keep them warm and to help them sleep at night in between if they get stuck out in the country or the hillside or whatever. So it's the most important and expensive item that would be owned by, in this case, a poor person. And you see here, never take the cloak as a pledge. So a pledge is something that you take, like, I think in terms of if this person would owe someone money, they would say, hey, you owe me money, but I'll take your cloak as a pledge until you come with the money. And then when you come back with the money, I'll give you your cloak back. See? Taken as pledge. So that's what shouldn't be going on according to this instruction. And you see the same thing being taught in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 10 through 13. I think let's just turn there really quick to make sure I'm not referring to something different here. Deuteronomy 24, verse 10 through 13. Something similar. When you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not enter his house to take his pledge. You shall remain outside, and the man who you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. And if he's a poor man, you shall not sleep with his pledge. So let's turn back to Amos. When the sun goes down, verse 13, you shall surely return the pledge to him, that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you, and it will be righteousness before you, before the Lord your God. In other words, this is I think it's the same outer garment that's oftentimes also used as a kind of a sleeping bag or something to keep you at warm. Now, what's going on here in the book of Amos chapter 2, beginning in verse 6? So let's slow this down and read it again. So here's Amos again, building his covenant lawsuit case against the guilty, teaching from the book of Deuteronomy and Exodus, which is part of the Torah, right? You saw that picture before. The Torah being made up of a bunch of sources over here. No, Amos has got clear view to sources that are already intact, and he brings them up because the people should have known better. That's my case. That's why it just seems a little backwards, the whole Deuteronomistic history suggestion. Now, verse 6 in Amos chapter 2. Because they sell the righteous for money and the needy for a pair of sandals, these, who are they? These who pant after the very dust of the earth. These are the poor and needy in your community, Israel. These are the ones, on the head of the helpless. Also turn aside the way of the humble. And a man and his father resort to the same girl. What's going on here? A man and his son taking advantage of a girl. So let's just say this girl that's being taken advantage of in this particular charge against Israel is a girl who's poor, and she's representing her household, perhaps, having an exchange with this man and his son, because this family, her family, owes money to the man and the son in this individual situation. And on garments taken as pledges. So this man and the son say to this girl, your family owes us money. We see you have a nice thick coat that you're wearing, so we'll take that as a pledge until you bring back the money that your family owes us. The very thing that they shouldn't be doing, right? And on garments taken as pledges, they stretch out beside every altar. Stretching out beside every altar. In this context, and in Israel's context, these altars would probably centers for pagan prostitution. Because at that time, Israel was steeped in syncretistic religion and adopting the fertility god Baal and the fullness of what it means to worship him and how to have church and pay homage to him, which also involved pagan prostitution. So not only are they taking this innocent young girl's garment as a pledge, they're laying that garment down and they're saying, perhaps this, we'll let you have your garment back But you have something else that we want. See? We'll go over here and hang out for a while, and if you do that, we'll give you your garment back and you can go home. Full taken advantage of. Full, the wealthy class in Israel taking full advantage of in this case, the poor, and I think the poor and the innocent and the helpless. So you see he's building his covenant lawsuit case against Israel, the prophet Amos. And that's what we have going on here. I think it's a better way to understand the Pentateuch is better to understand the Pentateuch as a completed document. By the time we get to the book of Deuteronomy, we have the last little section on the death of Moses, which I think was probably not written by Moses because he's already dead, but written by a scribe of Joshua as a fitting tribute to the author of the whole unit. And that's what they have as they travel in to the promised land. They are taking on a portable filing cabinet, whatever you want to call it, the whole completed Torah from Moses. This document then becomes source material for not only prophets like Amos, all of the other prophets as well, pulling from and building their cases against the majority of the unfaithful, whether they're writing to Israel in the north, the pre-exilic prophets, or the exilic prophets writing to Judah in the south. So I think that's a more convincing case, and that's the way that we'll see the situation as we move ahead. So, we take the authorship seriously. Another thing that we want to appreciate about this is kind of now I'm transitioning. So now I'm moving away from Deuteronomistic history, but one thing that we do want to recognize with regards to our authors is, this is kind of a picture that I've put together that talks about what are the authors accomplishing in their writing. So these history books, we call them history books, Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. But really what we're talking about, it's this fancy word called historiography. Historiography. Now this word basically means history. So yes, the authors are giving us accounts of people, places, things, cities, and events. That's the history part. But also they're giving us theology. So when we talk about a book like Samuel, or a book like Kings, or eventually a book like Chronicles, these are historiographers, these authors, these biblically inspired, these biblical, divinely inspired authors. We may not know their name, but here's how they're operating. In this slide, every one of the authors will appreciate the vantage point that they have. So the vantage point that they're writing to an audience at some time in history. We may have a pretty good idea of what that vantage point is, but that's part of the scholarly discussion. But the authors will always be looking back, and then they're going to be evaluating theologically. We saw an example of that earlier today, the author of Judges, for example, giving us the evaluation. There was no king in Israel. 400 years of people doing what was right in their own eyes. Let me give you another example, another example, another example. And there was no king in Israel because they were forgetting their true king. That's his theological point. So he's looking back, but then we talked about taking that book and reading it with Ruth. We see a look ahead, or an anticipation of something that's going to come. Namely, there's going to be a king that's going to come on the scene. May not be any earthly king. It's going to be a special, unique king. Something that may come forth from the Davidic covenant, that kind of king. A Davidic king coming from, and that to come to establish that eternal, everlasting kingdom. So there's the looking back, looking forward, but also hearing from God himself, the divine author. So this is the human author working with the divine author and divine inspiration. We talk about that. But then bringing forth a theological evaluation for a specific audience that's hearing this message for the very first time. So that's what we want to appreciate when we talk about the authors. So we want to allow the authors, if we take this kind of approach seriously, we use the word bias. The authors are theologically biased. which is not a bad thing. It just means that they have a theological agenda. You know, let's evaluate 400 years of spiritual chaos in Israel and the northern kingdom. Oh, I'm not going to evaluate any of those kings positively. And here are my reasons why. And by the way, here's the reason why we're going into exile. So that's the author of Kings, who I do think is writing from that exilic period. He's the author who's talking to the exiles and reminding them, hey, this history that we just got done living, this is a reason why we're in exile. Bad king after bad king after bad king. So I don't assign that authorship to the Deuteronomistic historian. It's the actual author of Kings. So anyway, now also we see examples of if we take this seriously, the authors, because of a theological bias, they can be selective. That's another word that's kind of interesting. So, for example, I picked on Austin. You know, we looked at the example of the author Ezra, probably Ezra, uses the full Cyrus decree, but then one page over, the author of Chronicles cuts it in half. That's an example of not only theological bias, the author saying something theologically with the last word, let him go up, but also he's being selective because he's intentionally getting out his scissors and cutting it in half, right at the very place that makes the theological point. So that's an example that we'll see. Those are examples. Another one that's really interesting, I'll give you another quick example. Let's turn back to the chronicler, the historian who's responsible for Chronicles, in 2 Chronicles chapter 20. Let's turn there. This is another great example. Let's see, Joe in the back. Could you read for us in, promise not to, Second Chronicles chapter 20. No, wait a minute. I'm in the wrong place. First Chronicles chapter 20. First Chronicles chapter 20. I got to change that in the slide. So go ahead. First Chronicles chapter 20, verse 1.
In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, Joab led out the army and ravaged the country of the Ammonites and came and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem, and Joab struck down Rabbah and overthrew it. And David took the crown of their king from his head.
Wait a minute. I think you kind of skipped over something there. You read that right? First Chronicles 20. Wait a minute. Okay, I've heard this before. So the author of Chronicles has as his source material some of the same historical events, people, places, and things that was written earlier in history by the author of Kings. So let's see. Verse 1 takes us back to 2 Samuel chapter 11. I'm sure I read something. Was it 1 Samuel chapter 20? 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. I think you did something wrong there. Okay, go ahead and read 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1.
In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem.
Keep going.
Late one afternoon, when David arrived...
That's what I remember. Sinning with Bathsheba. Oh yeah, the author of 2 Samuel gave us those details, didn't he? Right there, starts with verse 2. It's not there in 1 Chronicles chapter 20, which is the parallel account. You see the example, the difference there? So here's an example of the author being selective and theologically biased. So the author of Chronicles is not going to paint this negative picture of King David. We already know what happened to King David. You know, we can go back and read, 1st and 2nd Kings again to remind ourselves. What the author of Chronicles is doing, he's writing to a different audience, not to the audience that's in exile. They need to be reminded of why. No, the author of Chronicles is writing to the group that's come out of exile. They need to be encouraged with the positive, the high points of the monarchy, the good kings, extra time talking about Solomon and all of the wonderful things that happened with the construction of that temple, right? They don't need to be told again of King David's failure. No, we want to hear more good news about the Davidic covenant and all of the positive eternal promises that God made to King David through the prophet Nathan. Those are the kinds of things that we see showing up in the chronicler's account of history. He's not making things up. He's just bringing in more of history that's more relevant for his audience. So that's an example of what we've got going on here. So let's do this. Let's take a 5-minute break right now. It's kind of an odd time. I kind of went over again from the top of the hour as promised. So let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and finish out the afternoon. So this is a shorter break. Stand up, walk around the hall, drink a water, quick trip to the bathroom, and come back.